What we want to do in this session is talk to you about NRCS specifically. And so we are really lucky to have two NRCS employees who are with us today who are going to talk through not only what some of the programs are that are available through NRCS, but importantly, what are the ways that you as land trusts and public agencies working in the land conservation space, how can you best engage your farmers, ranchers, landowners with NRCS? What's the strategy? How do you get them into the right door to get the right help for what they're looking for? And importantly, what are some of the ways that you as a land trust or an agency might best engage with NRCS and at what level? And again, we understand that many of you have great relationships with NRCS already. Some of you may not. For some of you, this may be old hat, and if it is, if you have suggestions on ways that you are working with NRCS, either at the district level or at the state level, we welcome your perspectives on that. But we wanted to make sure, again, because people did not have a high confidence level, that you know some of the basics about some of these programs. So we are really lucky to have with us Jessica Rock. Jessica is the acting state EQIP, so Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and CSP, or Conservation Stewardship Program. She is the manager for the state of California. Big job, and she's acting, I should say, until the end of July. We also have with us Tony Rolfs, who is the NRCS California State Soil Scientist, very focused on resource concerns. So how we're going to do it is that Jessica is first going to talk about some of those NRCS financial assistance programs, particularly focusing on EQIP and CSP, because those are the ones that are providing the financial assistance. I think it's going to be Jessica who's talking, right, Jessica, a little bit about how producers, what's the best way to get producers through the door or landowners through the door into NRCS, and what are some strategies there. Tony's going to then talk a little bit about resource concerns, and for those who know something about NRCS programs, they're driven by resource concerns. And so in terms of seeking assistance, knowing how resource concerns factor into ranking for some of these programs and applications, Tony's going to walk through a little bit of that, as well as engagement strategies with NRCS. One of the things that we're not going to talk about, I just want to flag this, we're not going to spend much time on the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. We understand, and I think AFT is one of the big advocates of RCPP for its potential of doing what I talked earlier about stacked conservation, the idea that you can do an underlying easement and then, in addition, sign landowners or producers up for other programs on top of that easement that comes with sort of financial compensation. RCPP is likely to be, I think, fairly significantly rewritten in the next Farm Bill. And in the interim, even, NRCS is talking about making administrative changes to RCPP that could change the way that funding is coming out the door. So we didn't feel that it was worth spending a lot of time on that program right now, because it's likely to change both administratively and then probably statutorily. But know that we will, AFT, as changes are made to RCPP, that we will be having webinars or workshops through the National Agricultural Land Network to keep everybody up to speed on what some of those changes are, because we think it's a very promising program. So with that, Jessica and Tony, welcome. It is great to have you both. And I think, Jessica, I'll just hand it off to you at this point.
Awesome. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jess Rock. I'm, as Chris said, the acting EQIP and CSP program manager. I'm going to go and turn off my camera. Just having some technology delays. We've had some storms up here today. But I'm going to talk to you about NRCS financial assistance programs today. And if you can proceed to the next slide for me. Thank you. So with NRCS, we assist with a variety of programs and different ways that we can assist landowners. Today, we're really going to be focusing, for the most part, on those environmental improvements and our stewardship. And so that includes assessment and planning, improving our natural resources, encouraging innovation, and then also maintaining and enhancing our existing stewardship on these properties. There are programs that protect and restore our watersheds, as well as easement programs within NRCS. However, those are a little bit different from what we're going to focus on today. And we can go ahead and proceed to the next slide. So within our environmental improvement, we have conservation technical assistance, and then we have environmental quality incentives program, also known as EQIP, which is really our flagship program with this agency. Then for stewardship, it's the Conservation Stewardship Program, also known as CSP to most folks. And over there on the right, you'll see our watershed programs that we offer is the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Operations Program. And then within easements, we have a few different easement types: Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, ASEP, Wetland Reserve Program, WRE, and then the Agricultural Land Easement Program, also known as ALE. And within those programs, there is the RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. It's a very complex program that falls into a lot of these different NRCS programs that, like Chris said, we're not going to get into that one today, but I wanted to give y'all an overview of what NRCS truly does have to offer. And we can go to the next slide. So with our CTA, Conservation Technical Assistance, this is where our customers are really gaining their conservation planning with our employees. Everything we do is voluntary within this agency. We're non-regulatory, and that's, I feel, the most important aspect of what we do in NRCS. NRCS planning staff will facilitate assessment and plan development with our customers to really make sure we're addressing resource concerns, but also addressing that customer's needs on that property. Then we can recommend practices to address those resource concerns. Folks can do this with or without our financial assistance, depending on where they are with their operation. And then a plan can be used to compete for our actual program funding. However, again, you're never required to go the full route. Next slide, please. So EQIP, as I said, this is our flagship program. This is really where the bulk of our customers currently are. And I'd say that's true for most of the nation. Project selections are all competitive, and it's really based on available funding. So some folks do have to try a couple times to get funding just based on what those resource concern priorities are, as well as what practices they're applying for. And we'll get into a little bit more here and later in the presentation, but there are ways for all of you to have a role in deciding what some of those priorities might be. So then these contracts typically are 1 to 5 years, but they are allowed to be up to 10 contract years. Payments are also completed on these as soon as a practice is certified as complete. And in California, we get approximately $80 million annually for this program. I was going to pull each and every state, but there's quite a few different states on here today, so I just focused on the California numbers. Next slide, please. With Conservation Stewardship Program, this is a program that not all states are using super competitively, I would say. It's still new to a lot of our customers. And this program is really focused on incentivizing good stewardship within their properties. And so this is looking at existing practices that these customers have already completed, while also adding incentives for increasing that stewardship, whether it's doing a full new conservation practice or enhancing an existing practice that they already have. These contracts are all 5 years, and you can renew your CSP contract at the end of your 5-year commitment. The big thing with this program that is especially different from EQIP is that your practices, once they're completed, you don't get paid immediately, unfortunately. You have to wait until after October 1, and that's when our new fiscal year begins. This is a yearly payment program, and that's why you have to wait until that new fiscal year to receive that payment. And in California, we receive somewhere between 5 and 12 million annually. And again, this program really has a lot of potential for customers to get in, and I can see this being a way that folks could help find those really good stewards of the land to bring into this program. Next slide, please. So you've all probably heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as IRA. So this was signed in August of 2022 by President Biden, and this is the single largest investment in climate and clean energy solutions in our history. Within this program, there's going to be $8.45 billion, and yes, that is supposed to be a B billion for EQIP, and then $3.25 billion for CSP. And so this is huge for our programs. This year, we just saw a little piece of that pie. Over the next few years, the amounts that states get for these IRA programs are going to be increasing. And so there's a lot of opportunities for folks to get in with IRA to get more conservation practices, but it is very focused. Next slide, please. And when I say it's very focused, it's because the practices that are allowed to be funded through this program have to be climate smart agricultural and forestry practices. Some examples of these include cover crop, reduced tillage, no-till, prescribed grazing, tree and shrub establishment, and forest stand improvement. Tony's going to get into more of the specifics in his presentation about these, but these are all practices that we have data to support that they're going to support that climate smart atmosphere and results that we're looking for. Next slide, please. So with the mindset of how do we get customers in the door, I wanted to go over this, and you all will get a copy of this presentation, and there's a link to take you to the full handout that you'll see here. This is just the top piece. I'm a visual person, so I really enjoy this top piece of this brochure or handout. It's the 5 steps to assistance. So first, we really encourage folks to get to their local field office and discuss their opportunities and their goals with an NRCS employee or a conservation district employee or the equivalent. I know states have different versions. And this is where we can really figure out which way together to go. And so as y'all are out talking with your customer bases, if you see somebody in need, you see a resource concern, you see erosion happening on the farm, tell them about their local service center, their local NRCS, and help get them set up with a phone call or a visit. Then after we've determined what their goals are, we can put in an application for funding. And this will be the full application process on the NRCS side. However, there's still step 3, which is eligibility. And this is where we work with our sister agency, the Farm Service Agency, and we find out if they are eligible. There's certain requirements such as adjusted gross income. There's also requirements for highly erodible land compliance, wetland compliance. This is where we're going to ensure all those rules are being met so that you can compete in our programs. Then, once you've done your application, you've got your conservation plan, you know which way you're going, you're eligible for our programs, that's where that competitive ranking comes into play. Then our CS staff will rank your application, and this is based on points that you get from local priorities, resource concerns being addressed, as well as, sorry, I lost my train of thought right there, where you address local priorities, your ranking for your different points or your different practices being installed, and then just resource concerns in general being addressed. Tony's going to go into more details as well about how that ranking point system works. And then step 5 is congratulations, you've been selected for a contract and now you're going to implement your projects with us. And this can be a short process or it can be a more lengthy process. And a lot of times it depends on the type of project that you're wanting to implement. Again, some contracts are as short as a year and some of them can be upwards of 10 years in that EQIP program. But again, there's a link at the bottom of this to where you can actually print this handout out and give it to your customer base if you know somebody that could be a good fit for our programs. Next slide, please. So now how can you all get involved past just getting our customers to NRCS or your customers to NRCS? The first option is a state technical committee. Every state has a state tech committee, and this is a committee which is advising the state conservationists on technical guidelines necessary to implement conservation within that farm bill. So this includes members from a wide variety of natural resource and agricultural interest. Here in New Hampshire, some of our members on our state tech committee are local land trust, different resource groups, and just a variety of knowledgeable folks, even from places like Extension, different colleges that have interest in conservation. So it's really open. And if you're interested in participating in your state tech committee, you can submit this request to the state conservationist, explaining your interest and your relative credentials. And again, just like on that last slide, I have a hyperlink here to where you can go to the NRCS website, specifically regarding the state tech committee, and you can figure out for your state who that direct contact is and get more information about their meeting schedules. Next slide, please. Another way to get involved is with our local working groups. This is honestly one of my favorite parts of my position back here in New Hampshire as a district conservationist. I participate in the local working group, and this is composed of local conservation districts or equivalents. I know different states have different names for them. Agricultural producers that represent a variety of agriculture in their areas. And so you do want to see that variety so you can get a viewpoint from all aspects, but then also our forestry landowners and other professionals with relevant agricultural or conservation interests. And so these really make up that local community. You don't have to have the same credentials as you do for state tech committee. State tech committee is really not farmers. The local working groups is where the farmers are able to get involved and have a lot more say about what they're seeing on the land and how to proceed. Next slide, please. And so some topics that we cover at the local working group include a variety of topics, but 3 of the major ones that always come up are our priority resource concerns held by the local community, then our outreach techniques, and then critical criteria that may be used in ranking applications. So I did want to stop here and provide a few areas that I've personally had experience with in my local areas with these local work groups. So over the last few years, there was a big need in the orchard community here in New Hampshire to have integrated pest management. We used to offer integrated pest management in the state. However, we'd gotten away from that practice set for a variety of reasons, but it was really time to start looking at that again as we have more pests coming in and needing to control those. And so we really worked as a local working group to figure out, okay, here's our priorities, here's the resource concerns that my farmers are seeing, that the agricultural experts are seeing, and here's how we plan to address it. And we really worked together to submit our information in a concise document to the state conservationists and the program representatives for the state to make sure those needs were heard. And what happened was, it was really cool. We were able to have money set aside specifically for integrated pest management. And then we also had money set aside for reduced tillage and some other soil health practices. And so that really gave those folks a leg up in making sure those resource concerns were being addressed in that community. And so their voices were heard, and now they have a really great integrated pest management system. And it's because they brought those concerns to that local working group and made sure that it was heard. And so if you have farmers in the area saying, hey, this is what's happening with our resources, this is what's happening on our lands, that's when you really need to have them be interested in working with that local working group and getting out there and having those concerns heard. And if folks are interested in their local working group, I recommend reaching out to the local field office or the conservation districts or the equivalents to get more information. Typically, these are a yearly meeting, but I do know some areas that have meetings more often to make sure that conversation is being a continuous conversation throughout the year to ensure that all needs are being heard and they are concise with their reports when they submit those for the state conservationist. And next slide, please. And that's what I have. And so I'm going to hand it on over to Tony. I do thank y'all for having me today, and I'll look forward to answering questions here in a little bit.
Good. Okay, Tony Rolfes, California State Soil Scientist. So I'll go over a little bit on soil health, my focus, and one of my focuses in the state is soil health. But the conservation plan, assessments, and ranking for financial assistance, and similar to some of the things that Jessica was talking about. But I live in Davis, and this picture that I have is just a mile north of Davis. We have a lot of perennial crops, orchards, vines in California. And I saw this sign. I thought that's pretty cool. They got that orchards capture carbon. They want to promote ag and how they capture carbon. And in reality, soils do hold a lot of carbon, probably 2/3 to 3/4 carbon in the ground, opposed to in the vegetation above the ground. So I thought that was a cool picture. One practice that we started, I'm going to get right into the practices, but one practices we added this year, no, it's actually last in 2021, so I think it's been around the 3rd year now, is this soil carbon amendment, code 808. In each of our practices, you can see there's a definition, talks about increased soil carbon, and then the purpose. So it has to do something like improve soil carbon, improve soil aggregate stability. But we couple that with this for this whole orchard recycling. And this is covered under the soil carbon amendment with this woody residue treatment. And what this does, this practice, you can chip the orchard after it's gone for its full cycle. And with this practice, soil carbon amendment, you can then incorporate it in the soil. So you stack those two practices and accomplish whole orchard recycling. The other things covered under the soil carbon amendment is compost and biochar. So those two can be added to soil through this practice. So as Jess was talking about, we have our conservation technical assistance, we have EQIP, and we have CSP are our main programs. We have many others, but those are the ones I'll talk about. So to begin with, CTA is really critical for our agency. That pays probably 40% of our salary, and it begins to help us begin doing the plan. Producer, the farmer may only want a plan. Maybe they just want technical assistance. They may not want to go, or they may not be eligible for EQIP. So we can just, through our technical assistance, which is key, we can work with them to develop a plan similar to this one. And you can see they have compost application, prescribed grazing, cover crops, range planning, and a number of practices they've planned. This is basically a resource management system planned for the whole area. So CTA, again, is very critical because that's where we do a lot of our technical assistance. Now, if they go into EQIP, if they decide and they're eligible to go into EQIP, that's where we can fix some of the resource concerns with EQIP. And they would have, again, like Jess talked about, they have to be eligible, meet certain things, and get an application going. So to meet those resource concerns, for instance, if we have, again, we have a cover crop code 340, this is one of our practices, practice standards. You have to meet a purpose or a resource concern. So you could be implementing this practice to reduce erosion, wind or water, increase organic matter, or increase biodiversity. Any one of those reasons could be a resource concern, and you're addressing that with this practice, cover crop. And in that cover crop practice, we have a payment schedule. So this is typically for fiscal year 23 or payment schedule. If you see the PR in front of that, that means it's a priority practice. We named about 6 practices in California priority, and most of those dealt with soil health. So if you look at priority cover crop basic, payment schedule per acre is $73 per acre. If you go to priority basic organic, it's $98 per acre for that basic organic. And if you go priority cover crop multi-species, it goes up to $91 and so on. So that payment schedule depends on the scenario you're going to use, what you're going to do in the field, and those are the payment schedules that you'll have. So once you fix that problem, potentially with EQIP, where you have a resource concern, you put a conservation practice on there to address that problem, and that fixes it, then you can do continuous improvement. Take it to the next level, and that's what we do with CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program. So what you might do there is apply for that, get into there, and you'd have these what we call enhancements. And so E340C, 340 is the same as the code for cover crop, but has a couple other letters in there just to show that's related to cover crop. But this is use of multi-species cover crop to improve soil health. So these would be species that would specifically improve soil health and increase organic matter. So we go from a plan into EQIP to fix the problem, into CSP to enhance that resource. And that's the system that we use in NRCS. I put this conservation innovation grants because we do have those. They come out annually, a national one and a state one, state CIG and a national CIG, but those can be used for innovative technologies to improve any one of these programs or any of our programs' technology. So maybe improve the cover crop practice, some of the technology that we use there. So those come out every year, and entities can apply for those, and they can be regional, multi-state, or just local areas in one state. And I talked about CTA, Conservation Technical Assistance. It's really important, it's critical. And you can see here's some just general, I'm going to zoom in. You can see that this is the cover crop implementation requirement for 340. There's a lot of information that needs to be completed. We have drawings we associate with that, seed bed preparation, the type of seed you need to tag, and you have to show the pure live seed. Are you going to broadcast it, or how are you going to do that? Planting method, time of year, all these kind of things have to be documented. Irrigation requirements, timing of termination, which is always important, many other requirements. And then we also have the planting specifications, and you can see there's a lot of planting specifications, seed bed preparation, planting procedures, how are you going to do it? Drill it, or are you going to broadcast it? All these specifications have to be determined when you're making that plan. And then again, termination. So you can see there's a lot to our conservation technical assistance and planning. So it is, again, it's a critical thing for our planners. All of our planners that plan a cover crop, if it's going to be certified, they have to have job approval authority. So they go through rigorous training. They have to show they can complete that practice. And we have like 160 different practices. So they wouldn't do that for all practices, but we would try to get as many as possible. So it's a rigorous training for them, and try to get them up to par, up to speed to plan these practices. I want to talk a little more. I'm hitting this conservation technical assistance really hard because it is critical. There's a National Conservation Planning Partnership that's been going on for a number of years. Their strategic plan in 23-25. It's made up of NRCS, National Association of Conservation Districts, National Association of Resource Conservation and Development Councils, the Conservation District Employee Association, and then National Association of State Conservation Agencies. And in California, those are CDFA, California Department of Food and Ag, and Department of Conservation. So in that, we have a partnership that, and again, it's because we're trying to increase that technical assistance. It's critical. CDFA really doesn't have technical assistance. They have grants for that they put out to different entities like resource conservation districts, but they themselves do not have that technical assistance like the NRCS does. And we are that's one of our premier things that we have, conservation technical assistance. So in this report, they did a survey of agricultural producers and conservation planners. And what they did is ask, what's your preference for receiving information about conservation planning? And 50% said technical assistance by personal visits. So that's really why we are really promoting that CTA. And then I know Matt talked about this, farm demonstrations, farmer to farmer, farmer to rancher demonstrations, 40% wanted to do that. Computer aided, that was pretty low. So tells us that that personal technical assistance is really critical. And in California, we have our own California Conservation Planning Partnership, and we signed an MOA last December at the Resource Conservation and Development Conference in Sacramento, and it's between CDFA, California Department of Food and Ag, NRCS, Resource Conservation Districts, and University of California Ag and Natural Resources. So here's the principles up here. We had coined that C2P2, so California Conservation Planning Partnership. Again, just showing how critical it is to get technical assistance. And with the IRA that just talked about, we're going to have more money and continue to increase every year. And if you think about in 1996, when EQIP first started, our budget then was nationwide was $200 million. That was nationwide. 2023 EQIP budget is $2 billion. And then you add on that RA funding or IRA funding of $8 billion over 5 years. That's a lot of funding, a lot of financial assistance to get out there. So we need that technical assistance to help get that out on the ground. So that's, again, I wanted to really cover CTA really because it's very critical. Okay, so the conservation plan, as Jeff said, that's the first thing, first step. Identify goals and resource concerns. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The identify problems. We need to work with the producer to get our goals, their goals and objectives. And then you formulate the plan and alternatives and then implement the plan. And then evaluate that as well, because it continues to circle around. You may add some things, you implement, and you evaluate. So that's how we work it. Here's our list of resource concerns. I know this is a large list. There's 47 resource concerns we look at when we go out on the land. And they cover soil, water, air, plants, animals, and energy. And I'm not going to go over every one of those, but we have a lot of those resource concerns that we look at. I'm going to go over the soil resource concerns. You can see there's 11 of those, basically dealing with erosion, concentrated erosion, and soil quality or soil health. So we have 11 of those, and maybe you've heard this acronym before, SWAPA: soil, water, air, plants, animals, energy, and we also look at the human factor as well. So those are the resource concerns I'm going to talk about. So look at wind erosion. This was on Maui when I was state soil scientist there. This is in the isthmus on the southern island of Maui, where they grow seed corn, and high wind, very high wind there, and the soils are really erosive. So that's a resource concern. This is on Big Island on Hawaii. Here's compaction. You can see that. Plus there's also water erosion. You can see the soils eroded away. So that's a resource concern. Organic matter depletion. This is in the Bay Delta of California. We actually do our conservation planning training in the Bay Delta, and I work on that, but they drained much of the Bay Delta, and so when they did that, there were organic soils, and those organic soils oxidize, and so they've had subsidence up to 15 to 20 feet in the Bay Delta, so that's a lot of organic matter depletion. So that's a resource concern. This is the Bay Delta as well. You can see these bare areas, there's salt concentrations, so that's a soil health, soil quality issue as well. And then when you have intensive Bay Delta, again, when you have intensive tillage, you're going to have a problem with your habitat for organisms and aggregate stability, which the aggregates are the home for the microbes, as well as allowing air and water to move into the soil. So those are the soil resource concerns and examples of how we look at those. We have tools for assessing those as well. And we call that planning criteria for organic. This one's for organic matter. And the objective is to maintain or improve soil organic matter. So some of the tools we use, of course, one of them is just client, producer, and planner input and observations. But we have this in-field soil health assessment worksheet. And that's this over here for soil organic matter. We look at a number of indicators like how much cover is there? Is there a lot of residue? Is the residue breaking down? Are there microbes and animals in that soil that are breaking that residue down? Is the soil structure in good shape? Are there numerous plant roots in the soil? Is there a lot of biological diversity and biospores? So if you don't meet these, you don't have enough cover, don't have enough residue breakdown, your structure is poor, you would have a soil organic matter depletion resource concern. So that's how that in-field soil health assessment works. We also have, you've probably heard of Russell II, a water erosion tool, and WEP's wind erosion prediction system tool. That's for wind erosion. Both of those generate what they call soil conditioning index. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in ranking. But basically, with all the types of operations that you do, you enter those, like if you're doing tillage and disking and whatever your operation is, going over the soil, and then what kind of plants you're producing. Maybe you have a cover crop, maybe you don't. Maybe you have high residue crops. It predicts erosion, but it also predicts how much, if organic matter is increasing or decreasing. So if it goes positive up to +1, you're improving. If it goes below 1, 0 and below, it's degrading. So that's a tool we use to assess whether your organic matter is increasing or decreasing. So we have tools when we look at the resource concerns. We do it in observation in the field and different other areas like that. So again, like Jess said, we start with the conservation plan and the plan practices to address the resource concern. So this plan may or may not go to EQIP. It may just be a technical assistance we're helping a producer with, and we look at all the resources. We put a conservation practice on those to address those resources. But if they do decide to go into the next step, producer completes an application for financial assistance, and we do conservation assessment and ranking to see how they rank out to compete in the EQIP program. So we take those practices, and for instance, again, we have cover crop. So here's Davis. I took this picture in February this year. Our average precip in Davis is 19 inches. This year we've had over 30 inches of rain. This was in February, and these fields are side by side. You can see what a cover crop does opposed to non-cover crop. And I just, like I say, I turned 180 degrees and took this picture. But for each of these practices, like cover crop, they get points that practice affects. So let's say for compaction, on cropland, we have all the different types of land uses here, range, pasture, crop. For cover crop, for compaction, that plan practice gets 25 points in the ranking system. For organic matter depletion, it gets 15 points. So this is just a general idea of how we get the plan practice effects. Now I'm going to go into ranking, and there's an algorithm for ranking. And you can see the ranking weight. Each one of these things gets a different weight. So plan practice effects, which I just talked about, those 20 points for compaction for a cover crop gets a ranking weight of 15%. So again, plan practice effects measures the benefits towards addressing resource concern with the planned practices. Each of our practices has those points, each of our practices on those different land uses. So that's how we get that part of it. Then you have the resource priorities, a set of questions that address national, state, and locally led resource priorities. And as Jess talked about, that comes out of the local working groups and the STAC, State Technical Advisory Committee. We can get that information from those areas. Same with program priorities, a set of questions that address program policies, national, state, locally led, again, local working groups, and the STAC, State Technical Advisory Committee. efficiency. So it defines how well the plan practices address the resource concern in relation to cost to implement the practice. So it's a cost benefit ratio, and that gets 10 points weighted. And then the last one, vulnerability. That's 10 points as well as ranking weight. So think about that erosive soil on Maui. And it's highly erosive, very high erosion of wind. And let's say there were no practices put on that, like keeping high residue or cover crops, and there was intensive tillage, that vulnerability would be very great, opposed to if you put a lot of cover crops, high residue on that soil, that vulnerability would be much less. So that's how we get our ranking. These are the weight factors. Those are the main characteristics. Here's an example of a ranking questions. And this is specifically for fiscal year 23 cropland pool in the San Joaquin Valley. We have almost 70 fund pools, and this is just one of those fund pools. So we have to set these questions up in the state. Every state does this for every one of these fund pools. And we visit those every year based on some of the local working group information and also the STAC, State Technical Advisory Committee information. So we talked about resource priorities. So it says reduce soil compaction. That's a soil health priority, resource priority. There's also reduce salinity and sodic management. That's a soil health resource concern. And the last one, improve organic matter. That's a soil health resource concern. So those resource concerns for this specific San Joaquin Valley cropland pool gives points for those resource concerns. Same with programs. If you look at this, we talked about the climate smart ag and forestry. If you're using one of those practices from that list, you get 100 points. And if you are in a source water protection area, 100 points. So those are the ways we are ranking these plans and practices in our system. And these again are all of the climate smart ag and forestry mitigation practices. I'll zoom in so you can see these are mostly the soil health practices. We have conservation cover, crop rotation, reduced tillage, cover crop, field border, mulching, all sorts of things. And we can come over to the other ones as well. Things under nitrogen management, livestock partnership like anaerobic digesters, a lot of grazing and pasture practices. And you also have all the enhancements here, agroforestry, energy combustion. So again, the energy one's addressed, wetlands and rice. So we have all of those are the climate smart ag and forestry practices. And there's 39 practices and 98 enhancements. So just a little background on how we go through everything. And I think that's it for me.
I have a number of questions, but I want to recognize that I get to ask questions all the time and others do not. So let me stop and first see if there are others who have questions about anything you all talked about yet. Anybody want to be the first one? Don't be shy.
So this was great. Clearly there's a ton of funding coming down the pipe here. I'm curious, are there ways we can prepare landowners now so they can net as much of that funding as possible? Are there specific plans that we should either be working with NRCS staff to make sure that the landowner has the plan ready to go, and or are there NRCS acceptable plans that might be produced by a non-federal partner that would allow us to say, hey, we've got this plan, the money's here, we'd like to implement it. Just constantly trying to think how we can be prepared to actually use some of this funding. So I'm curious on that planning question.
Sure, I can take that one for the first stab. Then Tony, if you have anything to add and you want to jump in, feel free. Really, when I think about it, definitely coming from that field office point of view where I've done the majority of my career, it really is getting customers to NRCS, because it does take time to work through those 5 steps of gaining conservation assistance with us. If somebody comes in on the last day of an application deadline, it's likely they may not be able to get through all the process in time to gain that funding. And so getting them to NRCS sooner rather than later is the biggest piece of advice that I typically give folks. And that's just so we have enough time to work through those conservation planning steps to put together the best plan possible. And then also, if you all can work with those folks that you're sending to NRCS to think about those goals early on. Sometimes when I have customers come in, they're like, well, tell me what I can do. If they come to us and say, hey, we're thinking about cover crop, we're thinking about, there's some water issues in this field. What about a grass waterway? Thinking about some of those goals already before they get to us, we can really hone in on what they want to do rather than kind of going through that laundry list to start the thinking process per se. It's really coming to us with some ideas and then we can build from there would be my biggest pieces of advice.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that, Jess, would be you said outside, technical service providers, right, or other entities, and that's again why we have that planning partnership in California to really try to leverage our partners to be able to do what we do for conservation plans, develop those technical assistance. So that's why we do that. That's why we set up that partnership. And we actually I just did a soil health training 2 weeks ago, and we included partners from the RCDs, in California, we call them resource conservation districts, RCDs. And then we also included UC people, ANR people, University of California, and also Point Blue. So we're trying to get all our partners trained up to do these conservation plans in the way that we do them and get them certified to do that. Because as Jess said, with the IRA, and we just had a meeting today with our chief, all employees meeting, he's concerned that we get all this done with the new money in the IRA. So we're really pushing to get more technical assistance. So, yeah.
That's great. Thanks. I'm curious on the FSA piece as well. Could we, because there's no nonprofit or private alternative to FSA, obviously, like there is with the technical service providers. Can you get a landowner teed up in FSA ahead of time so that there's not the same rush? Some of us are intimately familiar with FSA and the hurdles there due to the ALE program, and just so we're not at that deadline, the same crush. So can you do the same thing, get a landowner kind of teed up with FSA ahead of time as well?
For sure. I always encourage folks, start that process with FSA early. Same thing, if 10 people come in the door at the very last minute, it's a lot harder to get 10 through the door in an hour than it is over a matter of several months. So getting in the door and just, talking to them about, hey, have you gained more land? Have you lost land? Those are all changes that we have to make with those farm records. And if we start making those changes earlier in the process, it will be easier for all parties involved working through these programs. And it's important to remember that there are some yearly forms for eligibility that they have to fill out. And so when October 1 rolls around, if you're working with folks that might be interested in our programs, remind them, get in contact with your local FSA office to fill out those yearly forms for eligibility so they're not having to do it at the last minute.
So this is Chris. Can I just follow up? I thought, Brendan, that was a really good point that you made. And I just want to follow up on this kind of planning sequence. So say a land trust is working with a landowner who has not done any cover crops yet, thinking, maybe this is the time. I'm going to start on a smaller field, try it out, worth seeing if I can get some cost share support. If they don't have a conservation plan of any kind, they would go into their NRCS office, say, thinking about cover crops. Is that enough? Does that then, is the sequence that you say that, and some in the ideal world, you would have a conservation planner come out, identify resource concerns, then you apply to equip, or is that the sequence it would follow? Or do you just sort of, if you come in saying, I know that I'm looking for cost share assistance on for cover crops, that puts you right into that kind of technical assistance that's devoted to equip contracts, and it's faster in that way because you're saying, I think I want an equip contract?
I'll say it varies depending on where you are. In my work, I'll give you an example from my work unit. We do service customers in the order that they're coming in, whether they say they are just interested in cover crop or they say they want to apply for cover crop. We still need to do a field visit to do that assessment for resource concerns. And so we are going out in order of receiving applications or requests in general. Somebody could just come right on in and say, hey, give me an application. Or they could come in and say, hey, we're interested. Could you come out to the farm? We're going to treat that request the same in my work unit. I mean, there are very short-staffed work units across the nation. So I do believe folks when they say, hey, I told them I wanted to apply and I got immediate assistance. It does happen. I'm not going to sit here and say that doesn't happen. But really the process is you should be working through making a conservation plan and then applying for assistance.
Great. Mary Chambers had a question in the chat, which is, what geographic area do local working groups usually cover? Are they by county?
It varies. Up in my neck of the woods here in the New England area, it typically is by county. And that's just because we're much smaller states. I know out in California, it sounds like some of those local work groups are organized with more counties based on the land bases. So it just varies by state.
Yeah, and like in Fresno, I know, and Matt Angel's down in that area, but I think they have 2 or 3 different RCDs, and so they may have 2 or 3 different local working group meetings in that area. So it just depends.
Great. Other questions? I'll ask one while we're waiting, since I don't see any hands right now. And again, it's sort of related to, and I wonder whether there is a relationship. Tony, you talked about the C2, C2P2, right? Which is some of the partnership and the agreement that you have on partners to increase planning. There has been, I've seen it from a couple of state tech committees send around a recent notice that talks about that, particularly in light of the Inflation Reduction Act, that they are looking to do increase their partnerships at the state level to both provide direct technical assistance to landowners, or to provide administrative support for NRCS program implementation. My sense is that this was something that was being offered at the state level across the country. And I'm just curious, is that an opportunity for the organizations and agencies represented on this call to potentially have a cooperative agreement with NRCS? Maybe if they're not providing the detailed conservation planning, but is there an opportunity for a land trust that is trying to do meaningful work of connecting producers to NRCS, or doing more direct engagement around what some of these NRCS financial assistance programs, is that an opportunity for them to be potentially getting that kind of cooperative agreement, or a cooperative agreement that might say we're looking at both helping with the direct technical assistance around ASEP, since that's what many of these organizations on this call do, but we also want to engage them around these financial assistance programs. Is that a possibility?
Oh yeah, there's always possibilities with those kind of things. I mean, I'm just trying to think about it. So especially with outreach, I mean, outreaching to the customers you guys have in your easements to outreach about NRCS programs and what our conservation plans do and those kind of things. So there is that opportunity. I mean, and if those entities had some ability to do technical assistance as well, the one thing that we're trying to get all our partners that do technical assistance, we're trying to get them certified. As I said, our planners are certified. So that's a pretty rigorous thing. We want to get them certified because when we get that plan from, let's say, an outside agency, we want that to fit our plan because we have to take that and put it into our system anyway. So we want to make our job easier, but we do want to leverage that with partners. So yeah, I think there would be an opportunity in some sense. I guess it would just take visiting with our some of our people in California, NRCS, state conservationists, and at the state technical advisory committees would be a place to talk about that if they're, that bring up those opportunities. So that's what I'd say to do it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. We have a question in the chat. Are there specific NRCS approved contractors that landowners awarded cost share have to work with to implement specific practices or structures? So getting back to your point just now, Tony, is that in California, they have to be certified, right? In terms of, except that these are, I assume that once they have that NRCS approved plan, do landowners who are awarded cost share have to work with particular approved contractors to implement practices or structures?
I think what they're talking about is like if you put a pipeline in or something like that, and you have to have a contractor, you hire a contractor to do that, right, Jess?
Correct.
Do those contractors, do we have to have an approval system or can they just go out on the market and get whatever contractor they want?
They can use any contractor they want for those types of practices. They just need to ensure that that contractor is going to install that practice to NRCS standards and specs. However, there are a set of practices such as forest management plans, pollinator habitat plans, wildlife management plans. Within that series of practices, in order to have those plans written, it has to be a technical service provider. And so forest management plans, for example, there's hundreds and thousands of licensed state foresters in each of our states typically. However, they have to go through a process of submitting management plans to NRCS to be submitted and reviewed as a technical service provider. They also must maintain information security awareness trainings, as well as a couple other trainings in order to be considered a technical service provider and to be able to write those plans for our contracts. So that's the only stipulation on contractors per se.
Gotcha. That's very helpful. Thank you. Tony and Jessica, this has really been helpful. Really, really, really appreciate you joining. That is a wealth of information that we just learned. Can't thank you enough for taking the time to do that and to be with us this afternoon. So appreciate it. And to everybody participating, those 2 slide decks will be uploaded to the platform and available for everybody to look over. So again, thank you guys both so much. Really appreciate it.
All right. My pleasure. Thank you.